Okay, thank you very much, Nick. So I just put this slide up because it's my favourite climate change cartoon, and it was less boring than my title slide. So as Nick said, I'm very glad to be here today. Although I worked at CAT for a year on the Making It Happen project, I am living in deepest, darkest Derbyshire, so I haven't come far today. And I worked on the Making It Happen report, and as Paul said, the Zero Carbon Britain report showed that we have the means, we have the technology to achieve zero carbon. So this report was looking at, well, what are the barriers and how can we overcome them? So in 20 minutes, I'm going to give you a very fast run through of some of those ideas. So for the report, as I said, there are a host of barriers to achieving zero carbon, everything ranging from psychological to economic barriers. And we looked at how we could make it happen both within sectors and across sectors, and we included lots of examples of individuals and groups who are making it happen on the ground. So the report's on the website, and I will circulate some notes of this presentation and the slides afterwards. So first of all, we started with the 4 key sectors from the Zero Carbon Britain report: food, transport, buildings, energy, and looked at the barriers within each of those sectors. So starting with food, as Paul already mentioned, eating a plant-based diet is probably the most significant thing we can do to reduce carbon from our diet. Unfortunately, a lot of people aren't aware of those links, and a lot of people don't have the confidence to make the change and to sort of try out more plant-based diets. So reducing our meat consumption, particularly beef and sheep, and dairy, particularly cheese, are really significant things we can do. Fortunately, a lot of behavioural change studies have shown that transition periods, like changing jobs, moving house, or moving to university, is a really good time, it's a really good opportunity to get people to change their habits because they're more open to change. So students, when they first arrive at university, it's a great opportunity to encourage them to try a more sort of plant-based diet. We're also we also have very negative reactions. So asking somebody that really likes meat to go completely vegan is going to invoke quite a negative reaction. So campaigns like Meat Free Monday, which is a very soft, gentle way, getting people to just stop eating meat one day a week, is a really good way to overcome that barrier. Transport. So what needs to change? We need to reduce our driving and flying. We need to get more people onto public transport for longer journeys, walking and cycling for shorter journeys, and we need to get all our vehicles electric or hydrogen produced from renewable fuels. Cycling, great low carbon transport, also great for health, but the biggest barrier to cycling is the perceived safety risk. A lot of people don't want to get on bikes because the roads are too busy, particularly women who tend to be more risk averse. So this is a fantastic project in York called Bike Bells, and they have encouraged thousands of women to start cycling or to get back on their bikes through a mixture of motivational, communications and confidence building activities. Buildings use about half of Britain's energy use, and it's no different on university campuses. We need to build all our new buildings to zero or near zero carbon standards. Even more importantly, we need to retrofit the existing building stock to reduce energy consumption and heat loss, and we need to switch our heating and hot water systems to zero carbon. For universities like Sheffield, which are very research intensive, their buildings consume a lot of energy. This is largely because laboratories are very energy intensive buildings, and for Russell Group universities, on the academic estate, the laboratories can be up to 80% of their energy and carbon use. So anybody recognise this building? Centre for Sustainable Chemistry. This is the UK's first carbon neutral lab, so it can be done. And energy, the 4th sector, we have a highly centralised energy system based on fossil fuels, dominated by 6 energy companies. We need to significantly reduce energy demand across all sectors. We need to switch to renewables. They currently supply, I think, 25% of our electricity supply, but it could be it could be 100%. Universities can obviously install renewable energy systems within the campus, as well as combining heat and power, which you're doing at Sheffield, I know. You can switch suppliers or switch back suppliers in the case of Sheffield to green energy suppliers. You've probably all heard of Ecotricity and Good Energy, which are green energy suppliers. You may not be so aware of Robin Hood Energy. This is a new energy company set up by Nottingham City Council. It's the first local authority-owned energy company set up since the market was nationalised in 1948. It's not primarily a green energy company. They were set up as a non-profit to provide low-cost energy to its residents, but it also supports locally produced renewable energy, and it's a good way of breaking the stranglehold that the big six have. So those are there are a lot of sector-specific barriers and solution, but we found in our research that a lot of the barriers, most of the barriers, cut across the sectors. So the same things crop up time and time again. So cost, perception, lack of political will. So we reviewed hundreds of academic studies, government studies, NGO studies in these various categories, and so I could spend an hour on each one of these, but I've only got 20 minutes, so I'm going to give you a very fast run through of some of the key barriers and solutions in each of those areas. Firstly, psychology. There are many well-documented psychological barriers to acting or even thinking about climate change. In a seminal paper, Professor Robert Gifford identified no less than 29 psychological barriers, which he called dragons of inaction. So this ranges from everything from our primitive brain, our cognitive biases, our perceptions of risk, habits, ideologies, all those different things. For me, I think a really key barrier is skepticism. Not skepticism about that climate change is happening. I think most people in Britain do accept that and that it's caused by humans. But skepticism about the efficacy of what we can do as individuals or what government can do. You know, what's the point of switching your phone charger off when India's building, you know, a new coal-fired power station or the government's allowing fracking? And this promotes this feeling of helplessness that we can't do anything and people just give up and switch off. The belief that a group is capable of affecting change, it's called collective efficacy, is a really powerful motivating force. When we can see success stories of groups that have achieved something, it's really inspiring. It shows us that people care and it encourages us to act. And this is a photo of a Sheffield Green Impact team receiving an award. The NUS Green Impact Scheme, which encourages departments to work together, I think that's a very good example at universities of the power of collective action. Social norms. We're social animals. We're basically sheep. You know, we take our cues from how other people behave or how we think we ought to behave, ways that are socially acceptable. And we can use these in our climate change action. Many people are motivated by the idea of doing the right thing, but they just need a bit of support, a bit of inspiration, the right cues. This is Green Open Homes. I think this might be in Bristol. This is a national network where real people open their homes to the public. They can come and ask questions. And it's a really good way of overcoming barriers of knowledge or perception, but it's also a good way of normalizing these things. It's making people think, oh yes, well if the Joneses next door have installed a solar panel, why can't I? I don't know why universities can't do, you know, could probably think of a similar scheme you could do in universities. Senior decision makers are people too, surprisingly, and they are subject to the same psychological pressures and barriers that we have. There's some really interesting research by Lauren Rickards at the University of Melbourne, did a massive literature review on the factors that drive senior decision makers. She was looking at politicians and business leaders, but it probably applies to senior university leaders as well. So, although it doesn't apply to everybody, there are a lot of similarities between senior decision makers. Things like an education grounded in neoliberalism, a bias towards short-term financial solution, faith in technical solutions to complex ecological challenges, and most importantly, a real susceptibility to peer pressure. Even when they're concerned about climate change, they are reluctant to act on it because of their perception that this may not be acceptable to their peers. So what do we do? That leads on to communications. So to communicate well with anybody, but particularly with senior decision makers, we need to use trusted communicators, people that look and sound like them and dress like them, and frame the arguments in language that resonate with their concerns, finance, reputation, research excellence. cite the evidence that students select universities based on environmental performance. There needs to be more discussion of climate change in universities. It needs to be talked about and back on university agendas. You can identify energy champions, get them on board, get representation on key committees, get it on the agenda in staff student committees. Positive stories and imagery are really important. Highlighting the positive benefits of mitigation is far more effective in promoting action than fear appeals. So drop the polar bears, drop the melting ice caps, use positive images. You can use fear appeals, but they have to be used sparingly and with messages that promote agency. There's a really good resource called Climate Visuals. It's on Climate Outreach's website. It's a library of images that can be used, and it's based on research about what images work, and they have principles for climate change communication, things like show real people, tell news stories. Advertising. The pernicious nature of advertising is a huge barrier for action on climate change. It obviously fuels desire for more stuff. It promotes values that are unhelpful to climate change. We have a very unregulated advertising industry in this country. But in other countries, they have place restrictions. Sao Paulo in Brazil, a lot of US states have banned outside advertising, billboard advertising. Many EU countries restrict TV advertising to children. This is a fake ad by Brandalism. Brandalism is a UK activist group, and during the Paris climate talks, they posted fake ads all over Paris as a way of challenging mainstream ideology and subverting messages, because we all need a bit of subversion in our lives. And lastly, on communications, use alternative media. Progressive social movements typically don't have the support of traditional media and have always relied on alternative newspapers, radios. Today we have social media, it's free, it reaches a lot of people, you can mobilize millions very quickly. Facebook tends to drive news. It drives the traditional news media look at Facebooks for news stories. And the key is things that make you laugh, things that make you angry. That's what gets shared. So use humor, use arresting imagery, use funky little videos. And this is a great example by Greenpeace. They did this little video, you can watch it on YouTube, Lego Everything's Not Awesome, which showed a little Lego Arctic land basically being swamped by oil. It got 6 million hits and resulted in Lego not renewing its partnership with Shell. It was basically a protest against Arctic drilling. So carbon lock-in, I don't know if you've come across the term. It's a phenomenon which describes how industrial economies and big institutions like universities have grown dependent on fossil fuel systems over many decades. We get locked in to certain ways of doing things because technologies, institutions, regulations, they all co-evolve, and it results in a massive inertia and a systematic bias against low-carbon technologies. The way to overcome this is through innovation at a local level, development of low-carbon communities that can spread messages, it can scale up and eventually become mainstream. So a good example of a niche innovation is straw bales for housing, a very low carbon, low embodied carbon, very good insulating building technology. In the UK, the first straw bale house was built in 1994. By 2015, there were probably about 1,000, but they're all manually built, so it wasn't something that could scale up easily. Based on research at the University of Bath's architecture department, they developed modular straw bale walls, which would allow volume building. And in 2016, the first commercially available straw bale houses went on sale in Bristol. Developing low-carbon communities is another way, supporting low-carbon communities is another way of overcoming carbon lock-in. This is Transition St Andrews. This is a hub that promotes low-carbon living, and they've got 14 community gardens and an edible campus to try and teach people and encourage people to grow their own food. These types of activities, these local community activities, they're fun, they promote a sense of agency, they promote the collective efficacy, this sense that a group can affect change. They normalise sustainable behaviours, and they're also a catalyst sometimes for bottom-up political change, which is very important. Huge barrier, economics and finance. We need to create a level playing field for low carbon technologies. We need to remove the subsidies and incentives that exist for high carbon technologies, and there are plenty of those. We need to include the external costs of all those polluting technologies in the costs, and we need to look at the whole life costs of equipment and appliances and buildings. Something might cost a little bit more to buy, but over its lifetime it's going to save us a lot of money, and that's very important for a university as well that owns buildings and equipment. There's a massive investment gap as well. We're going to have to invest a lot in renewable energy systems in the next 10-20 years, and it's difficult to find finance. The Green Investment Bank is all but dead. However, for universities there is the Revolving Green Fund. This is an interest-free loan funded by HEFCE and operated by Salix. It is still running, isn't it? Or was it? Yeah, okay. And it provided an interest-free loan for low-carbon projects with a 5-year payback. Lots of universities have benefited from this, including Sheffield. University of Manchester replaced the lighting in its plant growth chambers with LEDs, which saved a lot of energy, but was also good, had research benefits because they could alter the wavelength as well. We need to move away from the outdated economic model of neoliberalism towards something that's fairer and more ecologically sustainable and not just solely based on profit and competition. We need business and ownership models that are based on social and environmental objectives as well as the profit objective. So things like cooperatives, social enterprise, community, local, municipal ownership. In Britain, a very small percentage of our energy is in any form of community or municipal ownership. Contrast this with Denmark, where 3/4 of wind turbines are in some sort of community ownership. There, they have legislation, right to invest legislation, which requires developers to offer 20% of their ownership to local communities. Here in Sheffield, you've got Community Energy England, you've got Sheffield Renewables. The university can offer support to these alternative business models, and many universities now are offering courses, master's courses in the circular economy, which is a complete opposite to the traditional linear business model of take, make and dispose. Although flying is probably a very small fraction of the university carbon budget, it probably is a significant fraction of a lot of staff and students' personal carbon budgets. It's a growing share of the UK's emissions, and there are very few technical options, so we need to reduce demand for flying. There's a huge inequality in Britain in flying. 70% of flights are taken by 15% of people. 50% of people in Britain don't take any flights at all. So a good idea to address this is a frequent flyer levy to replace air passenger duty. This sets the levy at 0 for the first flight, and then it progressively increases, so by the 7th or 8th flight it's quite punitive. This has been shown to reduce demand significantly, as well as raising revenue that could be ploughed back into rail infrastructure and other things. So moving on to politics, which is the big one. The transition to a zero carbon future is a political struggle, no doubt about it. It's complex and conflict ridden. There are powerful vested interests with a lot of money and political influence, but we can use the power of investors, shareholder action and divestment campaigns. And Glasgow University was the first university to divest from fossil fuels. Sheffield University students also had a successful campaign. We need coalitions, we need broad political support. Individual issue groups are not powerful enough on their own to affect change. They need to link together. This is a very successful coalition of 30 Welsh NGOs that worked together over 3 years to enact a landmark Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. And the 3 successful things they did, they had a positive message, they had very effective cross-sector working and a high level of ambition. So students are a great lobbying force, but joining together with academic staff, estate staff, community groups, other universities, you become much more powerful. And if all else fails, you can always take legal action. An increasing number of NGOs are suing their governments for environmental negligence around the world. This is the Urgenda Foundation, which successfully took the Dutch government to court in 2015, and in the US, 21 young people with the support of a university professor are suing the federal government over climate change. I'm going to skip these few slides about changing values, but climate change is not the root problem, it's a symptom. We've got to change our worldview and our relationship with nature, and religious and faith groups and arts and cultural bodies are really powerful catalysts for changing worldviews. So just to finish then, the transition to zero carbon, it requires radical system change. However, as Paul mentioned, our belief that this isn't possible is in itself one of the biggest barriers. And it's not, history has shown that radical social and technological changes are possible within a few years. It's not a step back, it's not a return to the past. It's one of the most exciting opportunities in human history. So this is my favourite quote, so thank you.